Whenever you're walking through the Mojave, do you ever think to yourself, I'd like to chow down on some iguanas? Or iguanas. I'm going to say iguanas, I can't say it the other way around properly. But then you realised, after scraping the chunks from your teeth, you know what mate, I haven't seen any iguanas, but all the bloody vendors seem to have them on sale. I wonder where they come from. See, the answer isn't as simple as a lack of fauna or a mysterious farming operation. No, it's a tale. Tale of survival, greed, and nothingness. You ready to hear it, mate? Yeah, I bet you are. Grab your Nuka-Cola, cook your Brahma meat, and load up your plasma rifle. Let's embark on a journey within the Fallout universe. But yeah, because I'm a drama queen, I'm going to tell you in story form. Here we go. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cracked earth as Norm Morguy, a ghoul mechanic and former rancher. He settled in his old workshop, leaning against his rusty chair he's had for years. He was staring blankly at his terminal, wondering to himself, is it even worth writing these words down? Norm has seen the world change more than most. A long time ago, before the bombs fell, he worked on a ranch southwest, tending to livestock, mostly cattle, but the occasional exotic critter snuck in too, and he had to deal with it, usually just to sell on further. Life was simpler then, or maybe simple compared to this mess. All that was left were memories now. A few creaky old vehicles, and a half-baked story about a species that never quite made it into the post-apocalypse food chain. Well, we seem to think they have. There's a lot of things in the wasteland people choose to ignore, but this has been eating away at Norm for a long time. He needed to talk about the dismembered chunks of iguana meat. He stopped writing for a moment, glancing up at the distant shape of New Vegas, glittering like a broken jewel. And then with a sigh, he muttered to himself, "It's now or never, you old bastard." The green tint of the terminal illuminated his distorted face. Norm had heard the legends, of course. The stories passed around the campfires, the bars, the true source of iguana meat. The stories that danced around the same point. They used to be everywhere. Have you ever wondered what's an iguana meat? Maybe someone has an iguana farm. For all the speculation, Norm knew the truth. And it's far stranger than any rumour. It all started after the Great War, when the NCR was still trying to get its foothold in the Mojave. The region was a mix of dry scrublands, craggy hills, ruined cities. The NCR was always trying to make itself seem relevant, deciding to prove its worth by opening up supply lines, gaining control of land, providing the wastelanders a service they didn't ask for. One of the ways they done this was open an experimental farm, something they could provide food for the local soldiers, traders and settlers they were trying to court. It was called Project Iguana. Stupid name, Norm thought. Back then he was a younger, idealistic rancher, thrilled by the great idea of helping rebuild his society. The project started when the NCR stumbled on a few vault dwellers. Their vault opened too early, and they were running out of food. But what they did have was some iguanas, perfectly preserved from the pre-war. This was great timing for the NCR, because all the natural supply of iguanas were gone. I'm not sure what changed in the ecosystem, but there wasn't any around anymore. This is where they come up with a great idea. Together with the vault dwellers and a few ghouls from the pre-war times, they had an idea. They started breeding iguanas for their meat. Taking advantage of their pre-war knowledge, they thought the scheme had no way to fail. Problem is, the world after the war was not kind to creatures of old, and those iguanas did not last long. Most of them died. The environment of the Mojave was too brutal, too hot, too irradiated, too unpredictable. The iguanas couldn't survive, not even with all the science and care the NCR invested into their precious farm. These reptiles were just too fragile, their bodies too ill-suited for the desert's new climate. The radiation affected them. The mutated creatures became sick, weak, malformed, sterile, aggressive, blind even. The few that did survive, you could tell something was off with them. But the NCR didn't give up so easily. They needed the project to work. They needed something to show the people. So instead of abandoning the idea, they adapted. If they couldn't breed the meat, might as well manufacture it. The NCR scientists, desperate for any way to keep the project afloat, took the surviving iguanas and began experimenting with their DNA. Using all the pre-war genetic splicing technology they could dig up, the goal was to create a new kind of iguana. One that could withstand the intense radiation, the lack of water, the searing heat of the Mojave. Something they could farm indefinitely for its meat. Well, They didn't create iguanas, at least. Not real ones. What they made were grotesque. Some oversized, mutated creature bred for nothing more than its flesh. They were barely reptilian anymore. They had been twisted by radiation, by experimentation, by the relentless hand of survival. Some lived minutes, some lived months, some lived years. With the farm's success became new problems. There was an increasing demand on this iguana meat. As soon as the iguana meat was introduced, it became a staple in the wasteland. The traders in the Mojave picked up on it quickly. The supply flooded the market. Even though the creatures weren't iguanas, they had been branded as such for convenience. There was more stories for anyone to count, but people didn't want to hear. They just assumed it was myth. There was one over in Junktown, old Southern California. This is where the NCR got their idea from. There are rumours about this guy, Doc Morbid, who would sell human flesh disguised as iguana bits. He had a workshop under his surgery that he would repurpose his failed patients, or anyone who crossed him. His suppliers were in on the gig too. Hard to blame him, really. He had the stock, they would do little good in the ground. But he thought as long as you weren't chewing on a relative, nothing to lose, really. It's a nice thought to know he tried to provide to his local community. The NCR was aware of these rumours, but they assured people that iguana on a stick was iguana on a stick. It was easier to sell the dream of something recognisable in a world of mutant horrors than face this complicated mess they have created. If half the people saw what they were eating, I doubt they'd want it anymore. The problem is, the NCR started to get greedy. They started to use a variant FEV. This caused the mutated horrors to get even worse. Have you ever seen a centaur? Ever wonder where they came from? Yeah, they came from us. We made them somewhere. Some nutter along the wasteland thought it was a good idea to just chop and splice humans. But yeah, the NCR were doing the same thing. Problem is, the more they bred, the less meaty the meat became. It was a mess. So they had to compromise. They had to add ingredients. First it started with other creatures. It started off with geckos and Brahmin. But then one day, one of the workers fell into a vat with the creature, and it made something they could use. This is when Norm's story started to change. He was one of the first ghouls on the farm, pretty much the only one. They hired him because of his previous experience. But now, all they done was hire ghouls, because ghouls were, the perfect candidate. A lot of them don't have relatives. They live long enough to get a stone heart. They don't need to eat. They don't take radiation damage. And no one's going to miss them. So that's what happened. They hired ghouls, and the staff that worked there started to get replaced, thrown into the mix with the meat. Many ended up looking like centaurs, but some were a twisted mess of horrors, and some were aware. You could tell from the stare in their eyes that they knew they were real. They were conscious. They were monsters. So, the farm became a hard place to work. The NCR got tougher, the ghouls are more regulated, and the horror started to come out. Norm was lucky. Some of the creatures went berserk and broke out of their cells, almost like they planned it together. And amongst the chaos, Norm decided to leave. Presumed dead, the NCR never followed him. Norm bowed his head away from the screen's glare and sighed heavily. The faded light of the Mojave seemed to reflect the heaviness in his chest. He had worked with the iguanas. He had watched deterioration. Slow, painful end. He had seen the mutant experiments firsthand, and he'd seen the lies built on top of them. For the Mojave, the truth about the iguana meat didn't matter. It was an easy product to sell, and they're still producing it now. People wanted to believe in the idea of a pre-war world, whether it came in the form of a meaty stick or a Nuka-Cola. The people didn't want to know. But Norm knew better. But as the last rays of the sunset dipped below the horizon, Norm stood up. He grabbed his gun belt, dipped his hat, and left the workshop. His old bones hurt, but there was work to do.